these two. Alrighty. Good. So, firstly, obviously we're going to be focusing on the editing side of things. So what I'd mentioned is that unlike the introduction to digital film production skills, the editing, we still have a little bit more time for the analysis actually to be submitted, which is on the 29th of this month. So we've got a full 3 weeks or so. So it gives us a little bit more time, and the reason why that is important is we have done a lot of practical things on the editing side and not as much theory. We've started looking into some theory. Do you remember what we did last in the kind of editing theory?
It was the, I don't know his name, but the person that came up with the reaction shot.
Yes, to some extent. So we had Pudovkins with the 5 elements of editing. Yeah. Does anyone remember what the 5 elements were? I'm starting off really hard now because it's been a while. It's been a while now. It's been a full 3 weeks, I think, since we had the last editing session.
Are they like cutting to emotion things, or were they general?
There were different terms that well, I can help us out just to kind of yeah. So where's got it ready here somewhere. So we were having a look at this video, and in particular we have got a listing of the 5 different elements which were listed. Here we go. Alright, contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. Any idea which one meant what and what they were each standing for?
Parallelism.
Okay. I mean, the words don't necessarily kind of leap out, but they give you kind of indication of, you know, sometimes you can think of also the films that were used maybe to explain some of those. So for example, for contrast, we were seeing an excerpt from The Godfather, if you remember that video. We did watch the video, didn't we?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, good again. Just double checking, because sometimes I'm preparing kind of materials, and I'm like, okay, and then when I kind of go back to the preparation, like, okay, we've done it. No, we haven't. Okay, so contrast. So the contrasting example was the scene where the Godfather is at a christening of his goddaughter or his daughter or something like this, whilst intercutting all of the killings that are happening whilst he's in that church. So we keep cutting backwards and forwards between the church scene where his daughter is being christened and all of the brutal killings that are taking place in his name whilst that is happening. So these were those kind of shots. Can you see it at the bottom?
Oh, right, yes, yeah.
So there's the guy on the massage table, the guy gets stuck in the revolving door, and then we see always back in the church, and then on the steps outside, and so on and so forth. Another example of contrast was the bone being chucked up in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So the bone being thrown up in the air and then it turning into a space station. You can't see it here on the preview, but that is again contrasting shots. Okay, that is supposed to two very different elements that are juxtaposed to make a particular point. So in the first one, it's about the kind of two-facedness of the Godfather was following, strict religious practices and actually denouncing evil. Actually, it's being said, are you going to denounce evil? Yes, I will. Whilst all of his henchmen are doing all of these brutal killings. And the other example for contrast was 2001, so where we go from the bone being thrown up in the air to the space station as a contrast of technological advancement, within a certain amount of years, so to kind of propel us into the future and give us that contrast again, showing us in a way how humankind has evolved. At the same time, that start sequence, I don't remember how much of it we saw, but there's like an element, like a space-like object that the monkeys kind of go around of, so we kind of get a glimpse that might be relevant later on, and having bridged that extreme long time gap, it will bear relevance then later on in the film, where we realize that an ancient thing is actually on Earth already. So that's on the contrast. Parallelism. Any ideas on that one? What is the parallelism about? This is obviously, mostly for us to kind of really get to grips with that terminology, so that we can hopefully apply that also within our editing analyses. Not necessarily, you certainly won't be using all of these terms, because I'd be very surprised if all of these editing techniques will feature. It might be that one, maybe two feature in your editing analysis, but that's why it's really important to kind of understand those terms and potentially be able to apply them to your editing analysis. So parallelism is when certain similar looking shots, so the match cut would be a very good example of parallelism. Okay, you have an optical parallel to something that's happening. Here, we can have a look at the examples for parallelism. So here we had the scene from Hugo with this kind of clockwork type things, and here Paris. So again, we have got some geometric kind of parallel forms, the concentric circles with outgoing beams outwards, and then you have other things such as so that was the other example of a audio match cut, where there was the scream from the lady, and then we cut to Jeff Goldblum kind of yawning at the train station. Okay, so match cuts are examples of parallelism. There we go.
Symbolism.
Yeah.
Simultaneity. And latency.
Okay. Symbolism.
Is that an obvious one?
Well, it is kind of what it says on the tin. It's using symbols, things to represent other things. So here so here's symbolism. We had the Lawrence of Arabia cut, where we had this famous cut from him blowing out the match to cutting them to the heat of the desert. So we get the heat reference, which plays a significant role in the movie. So we kind of make already that link, So that was one of the examples, and the other one was here, the symbolism of the drain being used as an edit. So we've got here the parallel of the victim's eye and the drain, and juxtaposing those two again is an example of visual parallelism, but at the same time there's also a certain amount of symbolism associated with it. So here it's kind of a life washed down the drain, life is kind of fading away from her and she is dying. Simultaneity, So, oops, already went into the examples. What was that one? So, also known as cross-cutting. It makes it even easier.
Where you switch between scenes, like, for example, I think that was the Silence of the Lambs song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, and there the thing that is very clever about the Silence of the Lambs ones is that there is this kind of cross-cutting where we think we are kind of outside the house and inside the house, but then actually in the last moment we realize no, actually they are at the wrong house, and that whole build-up kind of becomes a huge anticlimax because we're like, oh my god, yeah, he's going to open the doors to the SWAT team. And it's like, no, he's opening the doors to somebody standing there, and the SWAT team is going into an empty house, and so that's a very effective use of simultaneity in the storytelling. So all of these are not necessarily editing techniques, but they are certain styles of editing. Okay, so don't refer to them as editing techniques. They are styles. Techniques are much more things like, cross-cutting is a technique. Simultaneity is the way that you tell the story through cross-cutting. Okay, so the AKA cross-cutting, I don't quite agree with it, where they kind of say like AKA cross-cutting, because yes, you are using cross-cutting to use simultaneity in your storytelling. Does that make sense? There's a slight difference between the technique and the style. Okay, so editing style is a simultaneity, telling two stories parallel that are maybe joined together or not, and cross-cutting is the technique that you might be doing for that. There's other things that you can do with simultaneity which isn't cross-cutting. For example, if you have a split screen and you've got two stories parallel kind of showing on either side of the screen, that would also be an example of simultaneity, but that doesn't use cross-cutting. Okay, perfectly legitimate editing technique to create that style of simultaneity. Does that make sense? So two different things: editing styles, here we go, and the editing techniques are the particular cuts that we're talking about. So Silence of the Lambs obviously was the big one, and then leitmotif. Everybody loves a good German word. Anyone remembers what that means? Leitmotif, the actual translation of leitmotif is a leading motive or a leading framework. Okay, so the leading framework is often referred to, a leitmotif is most often referred to in terms of musical leitmotif. So you might have certain leitmotifs, like such as string stabs, what we call like jing, jing, jing. Okay, we associate that with horror. Something of the horror genre is happening in the moment when you hear these kind of strings happening. That has been happening since I think that's when it was first used. It was Psycho, probably. Psycho, yeah. There are other kind of leitmotifs that are not audio leitmotifs. Well, actually, another audio leitmotif could be where you are expecting something. I don't know if anyone ever saw Lost, the series, but whenever there was a flashback because there's a lot of characters trapped on an island, and whenever we were going on a flashback to what that character's life was before being on that island, there was always this swooshing sound where we kind of knew, okay, whatever's happening next is going to be a flashback to what the person's previous life was. It's not kind of cutting to the next scene where they're rescued or whatnot. And that was important part of the storytelling. It was, but now when we look at visual leitmotifs, so here leitmotifs, you have got here a lot of musical ones, so the Star Wars theme, the Indiana Jones theme, it's where you knew, Star Wars especially, you knew that certain characters were turning up if you heard a certain song, a certain tune, so the Imperial March and so on. And then you come to the visual leitmotifs. So whenever you had these underwater shots, okay, you knew like, okay, something is, there's danger, there's potential danger that's coming. that could be real danger or perceived danger. So there's a few scenes there where they use the leitmotif to kind of build up people's anxieties. You know, this was a different kind of point of view that people were always thinking, okay, this is the shark's point of view. But then sometimes it resulted in a shark attack. Sometimes it was, again, a kind of misdirection where suddenly it was the girlfriend's boyfriend who's just scaring her by leaping up from the depth and kind of rising just next to her. So, and it makes the audience jump because we think like, it's going to be a shark. No, it's actually somebody just having fun. So those are those kind of visual leitmotifs, and here you've got other leitmotifs such as, you know, characters looking at the clock. So the clock becomes a leitmotif that paces the edit. Okay, that's an important thing, that the leitmotif can be cutaways, it can be recurring character actions and so on, but it's that when in the edit there's a particular point being made about this to pace the edit, then it becomes a strong editing style. Okay, when you go back to that leitmotif. Okay, so those were those kind of 5 particular editing styles by Pudovkin, something like that. Pudovkin. Okay. So maybe, I don't know, can you, like in your sequences that you are analyzing, can you see any such of those styles being present? Doesn't need to be, but I'm thinking maybe there's something that you can think of. I don't know, which one was it that you were doing for the editing?
I was doing a scene for Dunkirk.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, I don't know, did you show us the scene from Dunkirk?
No, I didn't.
No? Okay, should we just bring it up on the big screen? Let's give it a quick go. Is there an obvious YouTube search that I can do for it?
I'm just looking for it now. I've just typed in Dunkirk scene. It's the one Dunkirk rescue civilian boats.
Civilian boats arrive at Dunkirk beach evacuation. Alrighty.
Start feeling good about money with personal and business banking from Starling Bank.
Well, thank you.
What do you see? Home. Is he all right? The boy?
No. No, he's not. Dad! There's man in the water!
This is what
Okay.
I'm thinking.
Think you know top stuff?
Alrighty. Yeah, so difficult, isn't it? Anything that leaps up to mind? I mean, maybe it's not quite as straightforward.
Maybe symbolism, symbol that it's the end of the war because of them
Yeah.
coming home.
Yeah, but I mean that would be obviously an overall kind of. There's not a particular cut or edit point that would symbolize. Obviously, the whole process is notable, but we don't have a kind of visual representation, something that we could necessarily use. Maybe there is, but I mean the whole scene certainly does have. Oh, bloody adverts, isn't it? Can't save yourself for adverts. I mean, obviously there's, an emotional kind of turn around here, where's the fear, and then obviously the arrival of the boats with new threats then arriving towards here where things are happening. I mean, I don't know the film, I don't know who the main characters actually are. I mean, I presume that Ralph Fiennes plays an important part as well as he does, and I presume him. What's his name again?
Cillian Murphy.
That's the one. Yeah, Cillian Murphy.
He's on Peaky Blinders.
That's the one. Yeah, exactly. Also, he was very good in Sunshine, which was also a fantastic film. I mean, that was one of the films I think that got a Best Editing Oscar, didn't it?
Yeah, it's 2017.
Yeah.
I think Lee Smith, who was one of my people that I researched for earning a living, he won Best Editing, I think, for Oscar or a BAFTA, I'm not too sure. He won one of them. And he's also been in all the other Christopher Nolan films, like the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, and all of that. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, directors tend to stick with their favorite editors, especially the very high-profile ones. They tend to quite like that. I mean, what we can do, and that might be an easier way, is we'll have a look at at an example scene analysis from an older film where actually quite a few of those elements are present. But this also to give you a bit of a, like we did for the scene analysis example for Blink, just to give you an example of a scene analysis for the editing side of things. I mean, again, the editing one is briefer than what you need to do for the introduction to digital film production, the normal scene analysis. So the editing analysis is quite briefer, but at the same time, you're only focusing on editing, whereas on the other one, you're focusing on everything, including the editing. So for the editing, I want to make sure that you've got the terminology, the vocabulary, and the kind of analytical skills to really drill down in that particular scene. Okay, whilst you are researching a whole 2-minute scene, okay, I'm not expecting you to comment on every single cut necessarily, okay. but I mean, you might acknowledge individual cuts, maybe visually or just briefly kind of acknowledging them, but when it comes to actually analyzing them, I'll be expecting you to probably look at 4 or 5 particular cuts, maybe 6, but really drilling down then in them and seeing, okay, what, are there any elements of symbolism, parallelism, in terms of the editing style, but also in terms of the techniques. How are they used? Okay, how are L cuts used, J cuts used, and for the fluidity of the storytelling, and are there any kind of stark contrasting choices that are being made also in some of the edits in order to direct the audience's attention, right? This one is quite a stark example with lots of very stark editing choices, so it's got a lot to say about. It's not necessarily a film that has aged well, I would say. It would probably now be in the more art housey kind of category, although it was a mainstream film back in the 70s. Anyone has heard about Don't Look Now? No? I mean, it's a film with Donald Sutherland, and was, quite disturbing to say the least when it came out. And it is still, like, if you watch it now, I mean, it's got some. Let's say it like this: it isn't to a pace that we're used to now. Okay, so the pace is slightly different, and so it takes some adjustment to kind of watch it. But it is actually quite cleverly done, and every cut again is very well thought of, as we will see in the analytical comments as well.
This opening scene from Don't Look Now demonstrates the director Nick Rogue and his editor Graham Clifford's inventive way of editing to make visual connections between elements in the shots, to introduce themes of destiny and premonition, and to create tension and a sense of foreboding in the most innocent of situations.
It's a good question.
Lake Ontario curves more than 3 degrees from its easternmost shore to its westernmost shore. So, frozen water isn't flat.
Everything is what it seems.
I suppose.
Did you put all the window slides together?
No, I put the duplicates in my tray.
Oh, shit. Oh.
What's the matter?
Nothing.
The first significant
So you
edit
can
in this
see
scene
lots
is
of
where John, played by Donald
different
Sutherland,
elements that are in
first
there.
examines the ominous slide in detail. We're introduced to the figure in red, sitting to the right of the window in the slide. A match.
Oh, sorry.
Sutherland first examines the ominous slide in detail. We're introduced to the figure in red, sitting to the right of the window in the slide. A match cut creates a visual link between the figure in red and his daughter Christine in her red coat, whom we have already seen playing outside. The cut to her upside-down image reflected in the pond introduced an element of surprise, as previously we have seen her in more conventional shots. A further match cut is featured, which also serves as an insert. Just before John's son Johnny rides over the pane of glass, an insert of Christine's foot stepping in a puddle creates a splash. The splash immediately cuts to the smash of glass. This cuts to the shot of Johnny falling off his bike. The immediate straight cut to John creates the impression that John is reacting to the accident, although from inside the house there is no logical way he is aware of the accident happening. Nevertheless, the edit causes the audience to subconsciously make the link. Already the feeling is established that there is something wrong with this seemingly everyday situation. The cut is to a reaction shot. The briefness of this shot causes the reaction to be interrupted, as if only to suggest that John reacted, not confirm it. The suggested reaction is stopped by a straight cut to John's wife Laura, played by Julie Christie, providing the answer to an earlier question. Aside from the visual links, the subject also fits the emerging theme of water. A series of straight cuts run the narrative at normal pace, but enough strangeness in the way previous shots have been assembled keep the audience on their guard. A match cut from Laura putting her hand to her mouth to an insert of Christine performing the same action again repeats the earlier strange and impossible reaction shot. The insert suggests that Christine is copying her mother and shares the same reaction. As Laura is searching for something, we see an insert shot of the kitchen with unwashed dishes and plates of a meal. We don't yet know this, but this is the last meal before the couple's lives change completely. It is a shot of normality. At first viewing, the length of the shot appears to give this scene some significance, but as it is never cut to again, we are likely to forget it. The last meal only achieves significance in retrospect, after we know what happens next. Again, a series of straight cuts at a regular, comfortable pace, cross cuts from John and Laura to Johnny and Christine to re-establish normality. This works to lull us into a false sense of security before the chaos of the following shots. The course of action which will lead to tragedy begins as Christine throws the ball into the pond. The film cuts on action as Christine throws the ball in one shot, followed by Laura catching the box of slides in the next. The successful catch is immediately frustrated by the two straight cuts to the ball hitting the water and the glass of water falling onto the slide. The cut back to the ball spinning in the pond and the absence of a shot of Christine immediately suggests the worst to the audience. The following shots of Johnny fixing his bike and John examining the ruined slide are left to run ever so slightly too long for the audience. The audience desperately wants someone in the film to acknowledge what might be happening, and the length of these shots make the situation for the audience worse. The prolonged shot of the bleeding slide provides John's slow realization that all is not right. We know something awful has happened, but we're not quite sure what. Nothing has yet been shown to confirm our fears. As John's realization dawns, the close-up on his face is prolonged, interrupted only by an insert of Johnny running. This insert acts as some confirmation that something terrible has happened. John's race outside cross-cuts with the slow-motion shots of Christine sinking into the water. This creates a juxtaposition of speed. The speed of the rapidly cut shots of John is contrasted with the slow-motion shots of Christine. This cross-cutting between fast and slow actions suggests the possibility that John might save Christine, but as the shots quickly cut between John and his son reaching each other, as opposed to what is happening to Christine, it becomes apparent that John will be too late to save his daughter. The placing of the shots of Christine drowning is unconventional and totally unexpected. We never see Christine reaching for the ball, slipping and falling in. By the time we see what has happened to her, the tragedy is already in progress. It is too late to anticipate what might happen. It has already taken place. The whole scene is a variation on Alfred Hitchcock's theory of creating cinematic tension, except during the building of tension, Rogue subtly suggests many other themes, such as psychic and supernatural possibilities. Also, his use of cross-cutting is not as obvious, as he never cuts to the outcome until it is too late. Whereas Hitchcock's ticking bomb goes off when we want it to, when everyone is at a safe distance, Rogue's bomb has already exploded before we know it.
Okay. So there we go. So none of those 5 techniques are styles are mentioned in this analysis, but which ones do you think you could attribute to elements of that? Contrast in which particular elements?
The moments where their daughter's throwing the ball.
Yep.
Cutting to John, is that his name?
Yes, the main.
In throwing something to his wife.
Here we go.
Listen to a false sense of security
Actually,
before the
let me
chaos
just go
of
to
the
this
following
one.
shots.
There we go. Okay. I mean, contrast, why contrast in this particular?
In that case, it was two different elements that had sort of taken a similar path.
Yeah, but there you see there's the similar path. So contrast is not just the fact that there are 2 different things, but they need to be opposing things. Okay, so in The Godfather, they are opposing actions, very opposing actions. The kind of sanctity of a church ritual versus the brutal killing of people. So contrast wouldn't necessarily work on that one if we had something that was the polar opposite in terms of what is being shown. There are other ones though. I think this is a good example, but it's one of the other 4 that would work well for this one. Any idea, James?
I'm not sure. I think the simultaneous one.
Yeah, so simultaneity. So if we look back at the simultaneity, so let me just get back here. So just for clarity, where was simultaneity? That was contrast, parallelism, symbolism, and simultaneity, which was the cross-cutting element. So yes, we think that things might be happening at the same time. We don't know it. Like in here, we don't know if they were actually happening at the same time, but certainly the story was told as if it was at the same time. So there is an air of simultaneity that it could have been, but we know that the temporal, they are at different places. Like here they are, although the impression is given that it's kind of around the same place. So yes, cross-cutting has got an element in there which can be indicative of simultaneity, and at the same time, obviously there's a certain parallelism of action. Okay, so here you've got a visual kind of link between those, which also works there. So it's not as clear-cut, but yes, you can have a certain simultaneity. This kind of matching cut on action certainly does work. It's a throw that gets completed. And actually we do have less. Sorry, and then we've got this particular one where we've got so it's two kind of matching things happening with sounds kind of happening at the same time, and again this is where there's a particular audio match cut happening there. So it can, yeah, I think acknowledging things like simultaneity, or also the parallelism would work for that one. Any other elements that one can kind of see within there?
I don't know if this is right, the symbolism, where you see, I think, something smoking, and then you see the fireplace going on. That's just suggesting that it's hot something.
Right.
I think the other shot was before that. And go forward. I think it's around 1 minute 10.
Everything is what it seems.
I see, brilliant.
Did you put all the window signs together?
No, I put duplicates in my tray.
Yeah, so you see there's a cigarette
Yeah.
going up there and the fireplace, so that might be a connection.
Yeah, no, interesting. I hadn't kind of noticed that one. So you've got the smoke and the fire. I mean, we know that the danger that's coming is not. We know now, in hindsight, that the danger is not coming. But yes, so that there can be, I guess, a certain aspect of that. One of the things that needs to be remembered, however, that everyday life obviously is part of that frame about, you know, dirty dishes, everyday life going. In the 70s, smoking was bloody everyday life. If you wanted to represent normality, you were putting in people's cigarettes as well. So it may be partially to kind of signify some kind of danger, something might be happening, but it might also, just because it's the 1970s, it might also be like, okay, what do we do on a normal day? We eat, we smoke, we drink, we sleep, whatever. But yeah, it could be, exactly, and there's nothing wrong with kind of putting that hypothesis forward and saying, you know, that actually, you know, the visual association of fire and smoke could represent some imminent danger, and especially when these two shots are following each other, there's no fire without smoke, or no smoke without fire, this kind of thing, you know, that can have some bearing. There's another element of symbolism that is alluded to quite well, literally with one of the first shots, and later on here. What does it look like? Yeah.
The blood suggesting that she's about to die.
Yeah. You know, we've already made at the very beginning, we had a cut where we saw that shot and straight followed by her running across. So we've already made that visual link. Now, if that picture is bleeding, there's a symbolic element to it that that kid is in trouble or dead or dying, something like this. Obviously, it's not blood. This is the color from the slide running because the water just got spilt on it. So again, it was water that created the bleeding effect, which again has got a nice amount of symbolism in the fact that it is the water that causes the child to die. And so there's a nice symbolic element as part of it. So, you know, whenever you can, things like symbolism might not necessarily strike straight away as an editing style, but because you can say that actually shots can be symbolic rather than edits can be symbolic. But here it is a lot. This only goes into the Pudovkins kind of symbolism editing style, because through his edit earlier we have made that link between the figure and the child Okay, so it is that point of editing that created with us that image of like, okay, we are now associating this figure with the child running. Because if we would have just started on that and then at some later point seen the child in the red coat drowning, we wouldn't necessarily have made the same immediate link. Whereas here, this is a premonition, and obviously it builds a lot. This whole film is about premonitions, about destiny, and so on. So this seemingly psychic link that the mother has with the child and that the father has with the oncoming danger. So we alluded to those links by the fact that they were mirroring each other's kind of movements, the mother and the child, at a particular point when she's putting her hand to her mouth, and with the father kind of holding in when first his son kind of is driving through the glass pane, and then later on now getting this this sense that she is in danger from seeing this, works towards that film's theme. I mean, as you can see, this is a sequence that is completely, I would say, nearly overladen with edit choices that are supposed to be highly symbolic and are supposed to be mirroring actions of different characters to kind of create this sense of premonition and destiny and all of those themes that the rest of the films are going to be going to be permeated with. Yeah, so there you can see, so these can be used for different things. I mean, I can imagine that for some of your films, other elements such as simultaneity and leitmotif in particular, parallelism as well can be is often used in symbolism and contrast. So actually, you will probably see quite a lot of those in similar films. So you can have an audio leitmotif. So, for example, I'm sure that in Dunkirk there are certain musical leitmotifs that warn or that make the audience realize that there is impending danger. I think your scene actually starts on quite a threatening kind of musical soundtrack until he has got the time to look through the binoculars to actually realize, like, no, these are friendly troops, or not even troops. These are civilians that are coming there to rescue them, and then the musical theme changes as well. So I don't know if that particular sound is a leitmotif that was maybe used in previous scenes of threat and impending danger. So that would be one of the things, for example, to have a look at, because if you can find elements of leitmotif, I mean, obviously Star Wars is full of leitmotif, at least on the audio side of it. But then you also have visual leitmotifs, such as the lightsabers, very much so, and often also the colors that are highly symbolic of which side a character is in. It's not by accident that Darth Vader became Darth Vader in a scene that was bathed in red lava light. When Anakin dies, so to say. All of these things are quite highly symbolic, and especially in more stylized filmmaking like science fiction, this is often kind of emphasized even more. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to make sure that those 5 elements were kind of understood and could be applied. Again, there are no hard and fast rules with those. Okay, you can make assumptions in your analysis, but make sure that you understand those particular 5 terms. What I would suggest is that you make sure that you watch this video again. It is again on Moodle, so you can see Pudovkins' 5 editing styles, along with your knowledge, obviously, of all the different cuts and transitions that we've talked about in the early sessions. Because one of the things that this particular analysis didn't really do is it wasn't acknowledging necessarily particular cuts in terms of their names. Yes, it did do so with some, but you know, I would have expected some acknowledgements of when an L cut, when a straight cut was being used, or when a J cut was being used, because the sound does play an important part. So there were some scenes where I think it was the glass pane. Oh no, actually, so this is actually still. So let's see. We hear the bike. Okay, so there, you could hear it. The sound of the bike actually is continuous. You can still hear the bike even through the moment of her going through the mud. Okay, so it's these kind of acknowledgements of how certain elements are cut together in terms of the sound alongside with the video tracks. Okay, it's also something to bear in mind. Okay. Alrighty, so that was just as a reminder of where we're at with you know, in terms of your analytical skills and, you know, knowing how to use some of the terminology that goes alongside it. Any questions? No? Okay, okay. Right. Okay, let me just have a look. So what we've got otherwise, yeah. So I just wanted to show you here. So these are all of the materials that are on Moodle with regards to the editing. So here you've got Pudovkins 5 types of editing. There's the link to that one, and there's also we did watch this one, didn't we? Oh no, we probably didn't because it's unavailable. I need to take this off. Oh right. No, we did, but that was the very low res version. So it looks like it might have been taken down again. Okay, I'm going to need to sort this one out. Alrighty, here's a sheet also with. Oh, come on. Terminology, so a Word document. Quite unceremonious, but it's understanding certain elements also that are important for the editing. Understanding aspect ratios. Okay, you will have seen that Don't Look Now has got a very different aspect ratio to other films that are often filmed nowadays in kind of super widescreen or even scope, you know, on a 2:1 scale. You have TV films, you know, when Don't Look Now was screened, for example, on TV, you would have had a kind of 4:3, which is even more squarish than that. So that can play also a important part in your analysis, because depending on where it was released, so for example, the DVD release will often be a slightly cropped 16:9 ratio compared to maybe their scope releases. So here you've got widescreen, 16:9, 4:3, and then obviously the letterboxing, which is used. Anyone ever heard of anamorphic? Anamorphic, okay. Anamorphic is a very particular one, because for anamorphic shooting, you are using actually anamorphic lenses. Oh, let me find where there was a good video on anamorphic. think, yeah.
Hey, today we're going to talk about aspect ratios, the ratio of width to height that describes
We're
the
not
shape
going to
of
watch
your
the
film.
whole
Before
one.
you shoot a frame of your movie, you need to decide what aspect ratio to use.
Sorry?
A guy I know
Mr.
once
Steve
asked
Stockwell.
legendary Janusz Kaminski how he makes the choice. He said, it's simple. Landscapes, you use a wide aspect ratio. Dinosaurs, you use a tall one.
It's a dinosaur.
But is it really that simple? The decision you make about your aspect ratio will impact the staging and framing of every single shot in your film. So, to test Mr. Kaminski's theory, we're going to take a deeper dive into aspect ratios. First, a bit of history. 20,000 years ago, the earliest known art was painted on the walls of a cave. Art like this has no border. Soon, artists began to paint on objects and eventually on flat things that they could hang on walls. Initially, art came in all sorts of shapes, but soon paintings would be dominated by rectangles. Lots and lots of rectangles. And you can see the patterns in classical paintings. Portraits tend to be tall and landscapes tend to be wide. Why? The ratio of a painting's width to its height was usually determined by the content of the painting. So Janusz Kaminski might be onto something. If painters had painted dinosaurs, they might have chosen taller canvases. But movies do something that most paintings don't. They tell stories through time, and your choice of aspect ratio plays into how your story comes across. Let's talk about 235 and 185. These are the two most popular cinematic aspect ratios. 235, or 2.35 to 1, is an aspect ratio that was introduced in the 50s as CinemaScope. It's really wide, and you've probably seen it in westerns, grand adventures, and historical epics. 185, or 1.85 to 1, is a slightly narrower aspect ratio. Also introduced in the 50s, it's commonly seen in dramas and comedies, but it's versatile and can appear in just about any genre.
What is that, it's a numerical? I'm driving myself.
If you're faced with a choice between the two, which do you choose?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Let's start with 185. It gives us a slightly narrower, taller image than 235. This helps with dinosaurs, sure, but it can also serve us when we're framing up tall buildings or imposing figures. And look what happens with a close-up. The head fills much of the frame, so the shot feels intimate, focused on the character, without as much of the background competing for our attention. With 235, on the other hand, even close-ups allow us to take in a grand sweeping landscape. And those are the films where CinemaScope is most memorable. Films where the landscape, the elements, and the natural setting of the story play a primary role in the narrative. Spielberg, who would often shoot 185, was asked about his choice for 235 for his first theatrical film, The Sugarland Express. He said he went to 235 because of the highways. The film is basically one extended vehicle pursuit, so he chose an aspect ratio that would best show cars in relation to each other on a long, flat road. Jaws was also shot in 235, Spielberg says, because the shark is long. Jurassic Park? Dinosaurs. I wish the options were as simple as just 235 or 185. New digital standards introduce another aspect ratio, 1.78 to 1, aka 16:9. This is the standard aspect ratio for modern TV, and it's the default for most online video. And because we're not constrained by the size of a piece of film or by the particulars of a projection system, it's much easier to create content in just about any aspect ratio we want these days. If you want to make a movie in 5 to 1, you can. It would look kind of like this. I don't know why you'd do it, but you can. So the options can be dizzying. How do you pick?
Why does everything have to be so complicated?
Here are 4 considerations to help you come to a decision. First, genre. Study the playing field. What do other films in your genre typically do? Comedies are usually taller, so you can get your comedic wide shots without feeling like you're too far away from your characters. Drama, too, they're usually shot taller, so close-ups can be more intimate. Adventures, sweeping epics, and stories that feature dramatic landscapes tend to be shot very wide, so that even in a close-up, the terrain remains present on screen. Next, consider the level of realism you're trying to achieve. Do you want people to respond to your film as fact or fantasy? Of the popular aspect ratios, the taller ones, like 185, match our optical field of view more closely than CinemaScope. If you're telling a gritty crime drama, you might want your image to approximate what we see in the real world. But if you're telling a fantasy, it might help to present it with a wider image, something that differs from how we normally see the world. If we notice there's something different about the frame, we're more likely to accept the magic of the world within it. Your next step is to consider the setting of your story. In particular, how do the setting and the characters relate? In some stories, the setting is really important. For those, you should choose an aspect ratio that best captures it. This doesn't always mean going for the widest aspect ratio possible. If you've got a film where the tall buildings of a big city play heavily into the story, you might want to consider a taller frame to capture the feeling. A few years back, I directed a film that's set pretty much entirely inside a small house. It's an oppressive setting, so I went all out and framed the film in 1.33, like silent films and old TV. I wanted the frame to box my characters in the way the house was boxing them in. Finally, consider your characters. How do they relate to each other? If your characters relate horizontally, like gunslingers at the end of a Western, you can use a wider aspect ratio to really great effect. But if you're playing with the dynamic between tall and short characters, or characters who relate vertically, a taller aspect ratio might serve you better. If you're getting really stuck and can't choose between aspect ratios, you're in luck. We live in interesting times where filmmakers are experimenting with changing aspect ratios within a film. Christopher Nolan is perhaps most notorious for this. Many of his big blockbusters include scenes in both 235 and 1.43:1, which is the aspect ratio of 65mm IMAX film. Unfortunately, the only way to get the full effect of Nolan's shift between aspect ratios is to see the films in theaters. And there are other experiments. If you're like me, you've probably been annoyed by videos on your desktop shot in portrait mode. But a few years ago, some filmmakers released a trailer for a film called All the Stars Are Dead. Apparently they had made a vertical film. Other artists got inspired and a quiet film movement emerged. Now there's even a film festival for vertical films, and thanks to modern social networks, brands are now using vertical aspect ratios to shoot their videos and ads. But vertical films are far from mainstream. There was a huge backlash against the aspect ratio when All the Stars Are Dead trailer first hit. Some even called vertical filmmaking a design crime. So if you're considering a vertical aspect ratio, beware. You might irritate some people.
Vertical videos happen when you hold your camera the wrong way. Your video will end up looking like crap.
So, with all of this choice, it's even more important to remember that it all comes down to story. What story are you telling? And what are the best?
It wasn't that one. The other, it was a studio binder one that I had. Sorry, but just going on to the anamorphic, which was the original question.
In 1952, the movie This Is Cinerama was released, and the movie was a huge hit. There was a very strong interest to imitate the success of that, and that's where CinemaScope came from.
In the 1950s, television was becoming ubiquitous in the United States. Widescreen was one of the aspects that was brought about to make movies different than television and bring people into the theaters. One of the ways of making widescreen was the creation of the anamorphic lens, which was actually invented prior to World War I. Now we're at the 2000s, and suddenly we have televisions in everybody's home that are 40, 50, 60 inches. So there's been a ramp up in CinemaScope movies in the 2.39:1 aspect ratio in the last 15 to 20 years. And anamorphic is really one of the most cinema types of optics that there is. There's a quality to the anamorphic lenses that cannot be achieved through spherical or through computer-generated imagery after the fact.
It's just got a lot more clean lines. You get that 3D look, that separation, the waterfall bokeh. Those are all reasons why people love anamorphic, and I think what makes anamorphic special and unique.
Traditionally, anamorphic lenses were used to achieve a wider field of view on the film that they had available to them. These days, it's definitely more of an aesthetic
Now, lenses are being tailored and chosen specifically for their look. Whole companies and cottage industries have sprouted up to rehouse and repurpose and retrofit to be able to work on modern digital cameras. We've tried to correct out as much imperfections and aberrations as we can in the optical design with modern lenses, but some of those properties aren't necessarily a bad thing. When I get a hot backlight in a scene, and what that does when it reacts and bounces off the various sources in there and milks out that lens in an interesting way, that's it.
One of the telltale signs of when an anamorphic lens is actually being used is here when these kind of light flares, they've got a certain name and they were mentioning it. It's called bokeh. Bokeh is, I'm just going to write it down because it's not. Bokeh is a light point that is out of focus. With normal lenses, it's always perfectly round. With anamorphic lenses, it's always an oval shape. And the reason for that is that what an anamorphic lens does is it squeezes a wide-angle picture onto a kind of standard size sensor, or back in the days onto a standard size frame of a film. Okay, so you were shooting at a much wider angle, hence the picture was actually compressed sideways. Okay, so everything was kind of being squeezed together, and then it's only then later in the when they were doing the prints, when it was the film, or in editing, it was automatically kind of decompressed. That's why when you are editing in Premiere, you will have a setting which is the pixel aspect ratio. I'll just show that one, that you can choose. So for example, if you were shooting something on an anamorphic lens, all of the information got kind of compressed from the sides, like squeezed together. So your pixels are actually not square pixels anymore, but they are anamorphic pixels. So if I create a, right, let me just open up. Okay. So using the project which is not linked anymore, if I go into the sequence settings, my pixel aspect ratio, I can select here anamorphic 2:1 or HD anamorphic, or all of these things, okay? Because there are different ways that, depending on what lenses you use for your film, that your pixel aspect ratio isn't 1:1. Most of the times, you know, when we have got just a standard Canon lens on a Canon camera or on a standard HD camera, it will be 1:1. But if you shoot on an anamorphic lens, your aspect ratio will have changed, and if you put it in as a square pixel project, it would look all squished up together. So by telling it that your pixel aspect ratio is actually HD anamorphic or just standard anamorphic 2:1 ratio, suddenly your project becomes super widescreen and everything kind of looks in place. The only sign that will show that it was actually an anamorphic project will be instances where the bokeh is actually not round anymore, but more oval shaped. Okay, because the bokeh is a lens effect that happens where your bokeh reflects the how to say basically the shape of your lens. I mean, the shape isn't oval, but because there's an optical element in there that kind of stretches or squeezes in a way, sorry, not stretches, it squeezes the sideways light information together. Okay, the perfect round circle gets squeezed together as well. Okay, and that is the one optical point that doesn't get unstretched. Okay, because that is a reflection of what was the actual shape. You can actually influence the shape of your bokeh if you put a kind of mask in front of your lens, so you can put like a cardboard cutout of a star in front of your lens, okay, where your lens can look through, but parts of it are obscured by the cutout of the star. And what will happen is your bokeh here in the back will be star-shaped. Okay, so that has been used also previously in like music videos or anything, things that are highly stylized. Obviously, it's an unrealistic look when you have got something like stars or love hearts or whatnot in there. But anamorphic lenses, are generally quite, they do create a very unique look that is quite, quite pristine. It's very expensive to shoot on anamorphic lenses normally.
A look into the actual image that is burned onto the neg, be it digital neg or film neg. That's something that's organic to the actual image now and not a post effect I'm laminating on top of my image. Sure, you can add in dust and flare and anamorphic flare across a frame, but it's not the same as when it's actually optically generated from the glass itself.
So here we have a super speed, and here we have a Cooke 25. That's quite a difference. You're probably not going to rig these up on a gimbal. If you need to rig compact, if you need to rig in a small spot, this is something you want to look at.
These lenses are not as forgiving as spherical is. There are only certain ways you can frame people at a certain stop and still get a usable, sharp image. They really have to be lined up properly to get the superior image quality that the lens.
Okay, it's getting quite in depth, but this was just to kind of give you a little look into anamorphic, because I didn't want. So yeah, letterboxing, anamorphic, pan scan. To be honest, I wouldn't worry too much about this one. Split screen. Overscan again doesn't need to safe zones that can be important, so it's leaving margins around the edge of your frame, and then other kind of terms here: luminance, chrominance, RGB. Those are good editing terms to know. They are more technical terms which might not be directly important for your analysis, but I would expect aspect ratios to be an element that you comment on, even if it's just in brief. What is the aspect ratio of the film that we're actually just watching? Okay, that's an important part. Okay, so Dunkirk might have a very different aspect ratio to, well, possibly quite similar actually to Star Wars, but to something like End of the World, which was one of the ones that Tommy analyzed for his scene analysis. But because it is made for TV and it is about characters and people in a more real life setting, whereas Dunkirk is obviously a kind of big epic, and it's all about boats being on the water, so hence the kind of horizontal plane is much more important than anything vertical. So yeah, there you go. So there's a whole list here of film terminology as well. Good. Let me just have a look if there's any other bits that needed explaining on what we've put on Moodle. Where's my Moodle? Sorry, I've got too many tabs, clearly, because I can't find. There we go. And which one was that? Sorry, let me just very quickly catch up. This. Yeah, so I've done a sheet here for the assignment, which is also on there. Just reminding you of some of the most important videos that we've talked about. Actually, I need to add Pudovkins. bit on there. And yeah, just as a reminder, using terminology, produce your clips to good standard with clear audio, put Harvard referencing onto an end credit so that it's included clearly. Another bit actually about referencing, what is useful is when you are contrasting your own edit with a different edit, with other material, I would say it's good practice to always put a caption at the bottom of the screen as you using it. So you don't need to do that in the main film that you're analyzing, but when you are bringing in footage from other films to, for example, take to clarify an example. So, for example, if you're talking about cross-cutting and to what effect that particular element of cross-cutting has been used, and you want to say like, okay, well, this effect of cross-cutting in a thriller is quite typical, as can be seen in also in other films such as The Silence of the Lambs, and you then show an excerpt of Silence of the Lambs with cross-cutting. Boom. I'm expecting there to be a caption underneath that says Silence of the Lambs, Buena Vista, 1992 or whenever that came out. Okay, so acknowledge it on screen when you're bringing in other material besides your main film. Okay, and I would definitely recommend that you try to find examples. So when you are making, there are three different steps. You are doing your observation. Okay, that's where you are finding out about particular cuts that are taking place. Then you start questioning them. Why is this particular cut being made? Okay, again, not every single cut, not every single edit choice, not every single sound mix is worth questioning. Some of them are just done because it's a kind of standard to do with a dialogue scene. But then I would expect you to, for example, mention that as well. But for the kind of 4, 5, or maybe 6 different edit points or particular editing techniques that you might want to comment on, ask yourself the question. So evolve it from the observation to questioning it to then leading you to analyze it. It's where you are then thinking, okay, well, why is this a good choice at this point, okay? And then you start analyzing it. Well, actually, this cross-cutting sequence, together with the rising tempo of the music, does create a sense of fear and anxiety for the character as well as for the audiences. We ramp up the tension. This is often used in, and then to make it super clear, show us an example of where it's being used. Because you might say like, okay, this is to ramp up the tension, but you can either use an example to show that you are not coming up with it just for the sake of it, but that this has been used to that same effect in other films. Okay, the moment of elation when suddenly something, suddenly we realize like those are not enemy boats, and the music changes. Okay, and the way that it's shot, I don't know if it then kicks back to a kind of wider shot of the characters, just kind of like, being able to breathe, whereas before maybe the camera was a lot closer. I don't remember exactly that particular shot, but I could imagine one of the things that I would have done maybe as a cinematographer. I hope that Mr. Nolan did it like this, maybe not, but maybe the moment of tension, the camera was kind of slowly creeping in on the character, making the frame kind of getting closer and closer to the character, boxing him in, and in the moment when he realizes like, oh, no, actually, it's our friends that are coming to pick us up, then the next shot might be like one where the frame is again much wider, okay, where suddenly we've got this release of tension, okay, maybe with an even longer shot, so time for the audience to also take a breath, and the music changes, okay. So these would be some standard tension and release moments that would be covered through certain choices of editing as well as framing. Okay, you can't get away from not talking sometimes about some elements like framing and whatnot. You know, during your editing, you can't just purely be about the editing, but you know, make sure that obviously you have got a an edit angle. Another thing that you ought to do, depending on what's appropriate, refer back to the theory. So either come up with an example or come up with an element of the theory. Symbolism, leitmotif, parallelism. Or also, what I can highly recommend is this particular book, and there's 2 other books on editing, where there are certain rules of editing certain genres. Okay, you have got a more historical epic genre, you've got something that's more science fiction based. This book, for example, does talk at length about how to edit comedy, how to edit action, how to edit chase sequence, what we have, documentary, imaginative documentary, the epic, juxtaposition. So all of these things can be, you know, are covered also in these books, and there are lots and lots of different theories and styles that are specific to certain film genres, and I would highly recommend that you have a look at, you can do some internet research, but I highly recommend also that you look at some book research that you can hopefully find. I'm going to bring this book back to the library so you can take it out whenever you want, and there are others of this one, and there are also other editing books as well that talk about the theory of editing. We don't have enough time to power through all of the different editing styles for all the different genres that there are, because obviously, you know, some editing styles might not be as clear cut, but it's you know, we've given you like some of those building blocks for you to kind of be able to comment not just on the techniques but also the theory behind certain editing choices. Yeah, so try to kind of build it up from the observation, analysis, and then analyze. Okay, sorry, I didn't write analysis. And when you analyze, try to refer back to examples from other films or theory, and then there might be a particular quote. You are allowed to quote directly from a book. If somebody says, I don't know, Alfred Hitchcock says a lot of very clever things about editing, you know, you can quote him. You can show a clip of him saying that, or you can, you know, read out what he's saying. But what's important is when you quote, again, you put a caption at the bottom just to say, like, from which book do you have it, or from which interview do you have it, or from which magazine do you have that particular quote. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I would very much encourage you to do, to be able to show examples and to show some quotes that underline the theory that you are using for your analysis as well. Should we have a break? Yeah, it's 10:30. We've been sitting here for 1.5 hours, and I realise I've been doing a lot of talking. So for the second half, we'll do a bit more practical things, and I will also check up what Mr. Hill is up to, because we haven't heard back from him. Okay. Right. No, he has not messaged. Okay. Right. Okay. Actually, could I have some help bringing this bad boy down? So I think if we first, actually I'm going to make some space. Yeah, I'm just going to put the projector on here, so move it from there to there. Give this a try. Yep. Alright, so actually that's all right, thanks. Thank you. Fabulous. And this one is less heavy. There's, if you want, you can grab a handle there. There's two handles that you can pop out. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Let's just put it down on the floor. That's fine. Something fell down here. Fabulous. Thank you very much. There we go. Alrighty. Just one more, George, if you can. Thanks. So we'll put, actually, I need. There we go. Okay, so that goes in the back. Yep, that worked. Fabulous. Thank you very much. Cheers, guys.
does it go for your film analysis?
I've got a few more scenes on the script and then recorded it.
Were you on here on Monday, right?
I was here Monday, but not Tuesday.
Oh, yeah.
That was when you were meant to be doing I don't know if you obviously because I wasn't in, but feedback.
When I done my script, I'd assumed in my head I needed around 11 to 12 minutes of commentary, because then I would leave like 2 minutes for the main sequence. Yeah, so 2 minutes for the main sequence, and around 11 to 12 minutes of commentary, which gives you like 14 minutes. That's within the time frame. And I pictured in my head that I needed around 9 to 10 pages, because then you could say like 1 page in a minute. So I had that in my head. And when I finished my script, I went to 9 pages, around 6,000 words. And when I started doing my voiceover, it took me 4 minutes to say the first page. And if you add that up right, it took me like 36 minutes. Because every page, roughly the same amount of content, it took me like 36 minutes to completely finish my script. So I had to cut it down more than half of my work. So I went from 9 pages and 6,000 words to 3 pages and 3,000 words. And yeah.
I started recording the sound for mine, and it was the 5th of November, so in the background you could just hear. So I thought, right, I'm going to buy a better microphone. So I should be able to sound record tonight. And then, have you started the editing one yet?
Well, I started and finished. But,
is that the Road one?
Baby Driver.
Oh, yeah.
The opening sequence where they escape from the police. There was like Jaws for Dunkirk, that one with editing.
Good. So, I want to go through a couple more things for us. So, one of the things that we'll be postponing, because I did put initially for this week a draft presentation of sequence analysis. Now, we've obviously only got 2 people here today, but so we could either do little bits of it. So I know that George, you've got obviously something that you'd be happy to share, I think, to some extent. What you've got. I don't know where you're at, because I know that you haven't got your recorded elements yet of the editing analysis. Yeah, you haven't recorded it yet.
For the editing analysis,
yeah.
To be honest, I've only just got the clip into Premiere Pro, so I haven't.
Yeah, so you only just started with that. Okay. Yeah. So what we're going to be doing is potentially we might move the actual draft presentation to next week, because what would be great is, again, it doesn't have to be a finished bit, but so that you've got an edit to show for next week, where people can give some peer feedback on, okay, so that also as a way for you to kind of check in, like, okay, is what I'm doing kind of along the right lines? Okay, it's just a kind of way for people to check in, and also for people to kind of have a look at what other styles or the different ways that people have approached their analysis, because there's no right or wrong way to do it. I mean, there's certain kind of elements that are kind of require to be there, but there's a lot of creativity that can actually go into those analyses. So I want to make sure that we kind of get it right. Okay, there's a couple of other things as well. So one of the things I was going to be doing today was the multimedia editor, so importing moving stills, graphics, and rich content into Premiere Pro clips, which will be useful for anybody doing the analysis. As I'm saying, there's things at the very least, captions, but other elements as well that can greatly improve the clarity of your analysis. I know that George did quite a lot of those in his first analysis. I mean, if you want to do the presentation today, just to kind of show where you're at with the editing, I'm sure there's going to be some elements of that as well. Obviously, that's one of your strong points as well. So you might not need as much there, but I'm sure the other 3 might really benefit from getting an introduction of how to work with moving stills and graphics and whatnot. What I'm going to be doing, though, I will possibly move this particular one, because I think it's better when others are there. I'm going to move that element also to next week, because it's quite important, not just for the editing assignment, but also for the other assignment. But at the same time, I wouldn't expect anybody to do that before they actually start with the recording of their voiceover. And I know that the other 2 also still are working on their recordings. So in order not to kind of get things muddled up and so on, and people focusing on the wrong things, because you don't want to be starting to tweak like on graphics and so on when there's still recordings and whatnot that needs doing. So I think it'll be more beneficial if we move that to next week, along with the other 3 draft presentations for next week. So it doesn't leave too much for us today, but we will kind of work through some elements, I think, individually with how to getting ready for this, and also for our next assignment, which is actually happening very soon after. We've got a deadline of a live event edit on the 31st of January. However, we need to film these live this live event or live events during this side of Christmas. Okay. So the idea is, sorry, let me just get this back on track. All right. Okay, so I've put filming of live event in here on the timeline. However, there's going to be multiple live events that we will be filming. Okay, so it's not just a single live event. Starting with next week, Tuesday morning, we will be filming a live event at Swinburne Hall. So we're going to be filming a performance showcase by the popular music students. That will be on the stage, and we will have at least 4 cameras. At least 3 cameras. At least 3 cameras. Getting the action from different angles. Okay.
I did that once in the first year. It's concerts, and all the bands were doing it. And we had one at the front left on the stage, and one on the right, and the one that I was operating on was on the back. And it was quite interesting. The crowd seemed to enjoy it. So I certainly enjoyed filming it. I didn't get time to finish the editing because obviously there's 3 cameras. I got the footage I had, but the other 2 people recording from their cameras, they lost their footage, so it was a shame that we couldn't actually
Okay,
do it.
it doesn't give you much to edit with then. Yeah, well, hopefully that will not happen. We've obviously ramped up our professional practice since then. Yes, so we will be filming an event next week, Tuesday morning. So I will also be talking to John, making sure that obviously it doesn't overlap with other practical work for Tuesday morning, and maybe other practical work might be scheduled maybe for a different time or day for that.
I think he mentioned on Monday that he wasn't going to get us to the Tuesday morning workshop because the footage that we shot on Tuesday, he was going to do an editing session with us on Monday. So
cool. Yeah. And I think I might have mentioned it to him anyways beforehand, so that all works in quite well. Good. So yeah, we'll have our live shoot on Tuesday. It starts at 10, so I would say that we should meet up at 9:30 down in Swinburne Hall. Do you know where Swinburne Hall is? Do you know where Swinburne Hall is? Do you know where Phil's office is? No, not a problem. We will meet outside of K Block, which is the big building at the end there. Yeah, there's a big K on the outside of it. You can't miss it. So we'll meet on the outside of there, and we'll go and grab some cameras. Well, actually, we could do it that we all meet at the. Should we meet maybe at the equipment store? That might make more sense.
H Block.
H Block, yeah. You know what that is. Yeah. So if we meet there at 9:30, that makes more sense because then we can grab the bits and bobs that we need, and then we go from there to Swinburne Hall. Have got just about time to set up, and then you're off and running. And I'm going to leave you to it to kind of self-drive then the recording whilst I do the session here with the year 3s. And then you don't need to lug the cameras back up. What I would be expecting is that you back up the footage onto one of your laptops. I've got a card reader here if you're shooting on CF cards, or there will be actually a card reader in one of the bags as well, so we'll be fine. But then you can back it up there, so you don't need to bring cameras up here or anything like this because it's going to be too much. So after the events, you can just bring the cameras back into the workshop after having obviously copied all of the footage over, and then made a backup somewhere else. Okay, so definitely always 2 backups. I'm going to make sure that Tommy and Brandon are also there to help out for those because that's an important part. I'm aiming for us to film within the next few weeks leading up to Christmas at least 3 or 4 events, so that when it comes to actually editing a live event, that you have got a choice of 4 different events, including that one. So everything that we'll be filming in terms of live events could potentially be an assessment piece. All right. So let's make sure that the footage is spot on. Okay. Additionally, there will be also short tasks. So this is where you are editing 5 was it 4 or 5? I think it's. Yeah, 5 minutes in duration, 1 minute per sequence. So where you are editing 5 different little instructional sequences about how to use certain editing techniques. Yeah. Oh no, sorry. So it's just 3 short demonstration sequences. Okay. So the 3 short demonstration sequences are to showcase 3 specific post-production practices and sequences. Each of them will be just 1 minute. Okay. So it's not anything kind of complex that you need to show. Some people have kind of shown examples of cross-cutting. Others have shown certain functions within within Premiere, you know, how to do a multicam edit, for example, which is something that we will be going through when it comes to editing those live events, or other kind of techniques. It could be techniques that are new to you, or techniques that you glean from other tutorials. But the idea there is that you are recording yourself, narrating that, and also recording yourself creating those, or recording yourself showcasing how to do these certain techniques. So it might include elements such as zooming into a screen, kind of highlighting particular elements on the screen to make it very clear to the user what they are supposed to follow, okay, to make a very impactful visual quick tutorial that is 1 minute long. Okay. I will show you in good times how to go about it, but I just wanted to introduce the idea of what will be the next assessment piece, so that you know moving forward what we're going to be sort of gearing up to, because there's going to be an overlap of things we do between the deadline of the 29th. So we will be already looking at some things on After Effects. By the way, you can also do those instruction videos can also be about After Effects if you want, or they can also be about sound post-production. Any post-production software is fair game, okay, but it is about an instruction video for a particular kind of post-production software. And in 1 minute, you can't do much more than just a very straightforward technique showing you how it is. You can't show complicated workflows in any sense of it. So yeah, live events filming is what we'll do mostly here, and in there I will also be showing examples of how to create good quality instructional videos. We're also going to look a little bit at kind of visual psychology. You know, what do you do to draw people's attention to certain elements of the screen? So that's just the kind of lowdown of what we will be doing leading up to Christmas, and then after Christmas we have less formal sessions. So there will be peer reviews of draft screens. We'll have guest speakers coming in, and then we'll be doing final edits. Officially, the taught sessions are stopping from week 12 onwards, but we will still have sessions together, but there's not going to be any kind of front delivery. I mean, from week 12 onwards, it's what you call kind of off-schedule sessions, but we still need them because we need to be able to do peer reviews, so that we can write our evaluations, and so on and so forth. Okay. So yeah, that's the road ahead, and what we will be focusing on editing. I mean, one of the things that you will have noticed, is that in terms of editing, only the first assignment is directly relating to editing of drama. Okay, we are not doing any beyond to analysis. We're not looking further into the editing of drama. The reason for that being is that you're going to be editing drama in all of the other units anyways. Okay, so that's why we are concentrating on some other kind of more specialist techniques, such as live event editing and things like instructional videos, to enable you to have a kind of wide range of editing techniques that you're familiar with by the end of this first year module. We will obviously go more into editing in year 2 and year 3, but all come in good time. Does that make sense, otherwise?
Are we breaking up on the week commencing the 9th?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why it shows the 9th. I think it should be the week of the 16th to be the last week. Let me just have a quick look. I noticed that as well. No, yeah, that is the case. So the week ending on the 13th of December is actually our last teaching week before Christmas. So we are ending 1 week before HE does. But what I would say is that I'm probably, because we are not closed, but what I'm probably going to be doing, because we will need it as well, I will be scheduling at least one event to be filmed there, because it's Panto season. Not that we're kind of going to be filming, let's say, Panto, but there's a lot of performances on just before Christmas, so I wanted to catch at least one of those in that week after we break up, so you would still have access to equipment and all of these things. Alrighty. But yeah, it seems like, again, a longish break with kind of 3 weeks out before we get back on the 6th of January. So yeah, that's roughly the plan. Yeah. Yeah, it just seems so incredibly early where it says, like, well, the week beginning on the 9th is our last week. It's like, yeah, that's quickly.
It's normally we break up around the 16th to 19th of December, if I remember correctly, last year.
So last year, yeah, I think FE breaks up like a week later. Yeah, they continue all the way up to the 20th, but it is along the lines of the normal standard practice of the 12 taught weeks of at HE level. But we add obviously the week 13, 14 and 15, which are officially examination weeks for university, but because we don't have SAT exams, we kind of have those informal lectures. That's where we help you kind of finishing up your final deliverables and finishing up the evaluations for those. Okay, so we'll kind of give you another 3 weeks on top of those. But yeah, that's that is that. Alrighty, yeah. So live editing is something that we will touch on then in the when we've got that footage. However, bless you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to sort out my thoughts because now we're kind of shifting a few things around. So I'm going to keep this one, so I'm actually going to move them over so that we'll remember it's that way. Okay, so now we've got that. Demo of After Effects. Okay, cool. So what we'll do, though, we will still have George giving us a bit of a taster. Yeah? Hard drive, or is it online?
Yes, I think we might have to do what we did last time.
Oh, okay, downgrade the project. Sure thing.
Earlier on, I just touched my hard drive and somehow my computer turned on by itself. But when I want to turn on by myself, it doesn't turn on. No, it does.
Right, okay.
So yeah, that's one of the things that you might come across, James, that might be relevant for you as well, because you've got Adobe now at home, haven't you?
Yeah.
So these, because we've got licenses for many, actually, do you want to unplug?